the story of a man who just bought a brand new car. However, his close friend asked to borrow his car to travel to another province. Since he wasn't attached to the car, he let his friend borrow it. But when he got the car back, he faced a horrifying situation that almost made him want to sell the car and get rid of it. This is a story about Chris. He worked as an auto finance manager. Since his old car was quite worn out and a new model happened to come in, he contacted a friend who was a car salesman to buy the new car. Once he got the new car, Chris used it regularly. Until one day when his close friend named Jake asked to borrow it to go on a 3-day trip to Prackenbury and promised to return it afterward. Chris, being not very possessive about his belongings and considering the borrower was a close friend, so he let his friend borrow the car without thinking much about it. After 3 days passed and his friend still hadn't returned the car, Chris wasn't too bothered because he had another old car at home that he could still use. 5 days later, his friend finally drove the car back and returned it to Chris's house. From that day on, Chris started using this car as his main mode of transportation, and everything seemed normal. One day, Chris and his friends made plans to go for drinks at a local liquor store. After they finished drinking, Chris drove the car back home. As Chris drove through the area on his way home, which was currently under road construction, the road was riddled with potholes and puddles. Some streetlights were sporadically placed, casting light at intervals, allowing only distant visibility of the road. He had been driving for a while, feeling slightly tipsy, and began to entertain playful thoughts. He imagined that if a woman happened to be walking through this area, he would immediately pull over and offer her a ride. He even thought he might volunteer to drop her off at her house, or, if she preferred not to go home alone, he would offer to take her to his place to spend the night. These were just whimsical musings typical of a slightly inebriated person. However, as he continued driving, he suddenly spotted a woman walking along the roadside in front of his car. Despite his earlier hypothetical scenario, encountering a real woman in this situation felt strange to him. It was very late at night, and he wondered why a woman would be out for a stroll alone in this area at this hour. Assuming that motorcycle taxis might be scarce in this area, he concluded that she must be walking home alone. Chris decided to slow down, then parked his car beside the woman. He rolled down the window and asked where she was headed. She replied that she was walking home, and her house was down the alley ahead, which happened to be Chris's route. He could see her face clearly. She was quite adorable with fair skin and a lovely appearance. Chris then told her, "Hop in, I'll give you a ride." The woman approached the car window cautiously, glancing inside. She slowly looked at the front and back seats before turning to Chris and saying, "I'm not getting into your car." At that moment, Chris looked at the passenger seat beside the driver. He noticed it was filled with documents and folders. It seemed to be because of his work. Understanding why she might hesitate, he didn't push her. Instead, he reached over, gathered all the items, and placed them on the back seat before turning back to her. But by then, she was no longer there. He hurriedly got out of the car and tried to look for the woman, but all around him were just trees. He thought to himself that she couldn't have walked away so quickly that he couldn't see her. The time it took him to remove his belongings was just a moment. At that moment, Chris didn't care much and tried to drive home again. As he drove, he heard a tapping sound coming from the rear right window. Because the road was filled with potholes, he thought it might be the sound of the clothes hanger he had hanging on the back seat hitting the window. As his car fell into a pothole, he reached back to grab the clothes hanger. With one hand still on the wheel, he reached back while still looking at the road ahead. However, no matter how much he groped, he couldn't find it. He turned around to look and saw the foot of a woman outside the front window. It looked like she was sitting on the back of the car, with her legs hanging down towards the right side window. He saw her tapping her foot against the window. With a start, Chris quickly slammed on the brakes. As he did, he heard something fall from the back of the car and roll towards the rear. He was so startled that he thought it might be a person, so he hurriedly got out to check. In the back of the car, there was an orange light illuminating the ground, enough for him to see. His eyes followed the light and he saw the same woman he encountered earlier lying on the ground, her hands clutching her head. She appeared to be unconscious, and blood was flowing profusely from her head. Chris approached her slowly, concerned. As he got closer, the woman suddenly opened her eyes. At first, Chris was shocked, thinking she might be unconscious. But then she began to slowly sit up while still holding her head. The blood flow increased gradually, and she stared at Chris with a stern gaze before slowly backing away into the darkness. At that moment, Chris didn't think she was a ghost. He tried to call out to her because he was worried. Did you go to the hospital? I'll take you there now, Chris said. But the woman began to slowly retreat until she reached the ditch by the roadside. The ditch wasn't very deep, about knee-height. She continued to back away into the ditch until she disappeared into the darkness. At that moment, Chris was sure that the woman was not a real person. He hurried back to his car and drove home. Chris's house was part of a newly developed townhouse community, with several houses clustered together. His house was located at the end of the street, bordering the edge of the neighborhood, with more space on the side than the other houses. This ensured that loud noises wouldn't disturb the neighbors. As the neighborhood was still new, not many people had moved in yet, and those who did were mostly keeping the houses for investment, not living there permanently. However, there were quite a few people living further down the street. Lately, Chris had been hearing the sound of car doors near his house late at night, but he assumed it was just new neighbors moving in. On that day, Chris drove home as usual and parked his car in front of his house, as the driveway was occupied by his old car. As he was about to go to bed, there was an orange light shining from a lamp placed on the bedside table, along with his car keys laid out. He turned to switch off the light at the head of the bed and lay down. But then, in the darkness, he suddenly saw a red light emitting from the car keys. It looked like someone was trying to unlock the car. He got up and grabbed the car keys to investigate. Meanwhile, he heard the car door being opened. Chris tried to slowly pull the curtains aside to see what was happening. He looked down and saw the back door on the left side of the car was left open. Then, the same woman he had seen before began to slowly get out of the car. She gradually dragged her feet towards the back of the car while her hand still grasped her head. She slowly opened the back of the car as Chris watched in fear, realizing that what he encountered was not a real person. The woman slowly crawled towards the back of the car and closed the door loudly. Chris was so shocked that he didn't know what to do, wondering what was happening to him. He tried to stay calm and reached out to turn on the light at the head of the bed. But as he was pulling the cord to switch on the light, suddenly, as the cord was pulled out, all the lights in the house went out, including the one in front of the house. Before he could regain his composure, there was another loud noise of the car door being opened again. He slowly turned to look and saw the woman emerging from the back of the car, peering directly at Chris's face as if she knew he was looking at her. He was so startled that he quickly turned back into the room, wanting to escape downstairs but couldn't, as she was still at the front of the house. Not long after, the police arrived at the front of the house. Chris looked down again, but the woman was no longer there, and his car door was closed as before. He hurriedly went down to meet the police. And then the events of that day passed. Chris started feeling uneasy and drove to his friend's car showroom. He asked, "Is there something wrong with this car?" His friend replied, "Are you crazy? This is a brand new car, not a used one. How could anything be wrong with it?" Then Chris remembered that his friend had just borrowed the car. Perhaps he had hit something. Both of them started inspecting the car because they were car salesmen. When inspecting a car, they could tell if any part had been repaired before. But after thorough examination, everything seemed normal. Unable to find the cause, Chris had to keep using the car as usual. But then one day, Chris and his coworker decided to go on a trip together. On their way back, they stopped to wash the car because it was quite dirty. During that time, the car wash attendant noticed some gel nails, used for extending nails, lying in the area he was about to clean. He picked them up and placed them on the center console of the car for Chris to retrieve later. When they finished washing the car and got back in, Chris's friend who was sitting with him noticed the gel nails and jokingly said, "Hey, who did you pick up in the car?" They forgot their gel nails. "Must be a beauty." Chris asked what gel nails were, and as his friend picked them up to inspect, Chris noticed something unusual. Then his friend pointed out that whoever removed these nails must have felt some pain because not only the gel nails were taken off, but the entire natural nails as well. Chris looked closely and was shocked to see that the nails seemed forcibly torn from the nail bed, with sharp edges, as if they were ripped off diagonally. He began to think that this couldn't be a coincidence. How could nails like these end up in his car? Chris quickly drove his friend home and then drove the car to another showroom he knew of. This showroom had skilled mechanics who were adept at checking cars thoroughly. They could identify which parts had been replaced because some pieces would be factory specific. While they were getting the car inspected by the mechanic approached Chris and asked, "Where did you get the windows repaired? Why didn't you come to me for the repairs?" Chris replied straightforwardly that he had never gotten them repaired. However, the mechanic insisted that they had indeed been replaced. When they removed the floor mats to check, they found glass fragments scattered all over. Chris started to feel that something was not right. He instructed the mechanic to remove the seats immediately. Typically, if a car had been involved in a collision severe enough to break windows, glass shards would be found under the seats because it's an area that doesn't get cleaned thoroughly and requires removing the seats for proper cleaning. As soon as the mechanic lifted the seats, everyone was shocked. Underneath, along with the glass fragments, they found long strands of a woman's hair tangled in the upholstery. Chris immediately knew that his friend must have done something nefarious with the car. He decided to call the police without hesitation. Meanwhile, the police were preparing to summon Chris's friend for questioning. However, Jake contacted Chris first and confessed the entire story. Jake explained that he had initially told Chris he was borrowing the car for a trip to Prakanburi, but in reality, he took the car to Sakeo province for gambling at a casino. He went with his girlfriend and 2 other friends. He told his girlfriend they were going for a vacation while she stayed in the hotel. He went gambling with the other 2 friends. Jake lost all his money and had to borrow from the friend who came with him. But that friend warned that if they lost again, there would be consequences, suggesting they involve Chris's girlfriend in their sexual activities. At that time, Jake's girlfriend was still a teenager and quite innocent looking. However, caught up in the gambling frenzy, he eventually agreed, and he ended up losing everything. On the way back to Bangkok, instead of Jake being the driver as usual with his girlfriend beside him, he had one of his friends drive, while he sat in the passenger seat next to the driver. His girlfriend sat in the back seat with the other friend who was their creditor. While driving continuously, the surroundings gradually opened up, and there were no other cars passing by. Jake's friend began to sexual assault a woman, but she resisted. She called out for help, but no one paid any attention. In tears, she raised her hands in supplication, pleading with them to stop. Still, Jake's friend persisted, attempting to convince her. The woman bit and scratched Jake's friend, but he remained relentless. Eventually, Jake's friend grabbed her arm and pulled out her fingernail. She screamed in pain as blood flowed. He threatened her, asking if she would comply, and he reached for a short-barreled shotgun, loaded with a single shell. Holding the gun to her head, he warned her to comply. Despite her continued resistance, the gun accidentally shot, shattering the glass and leaving her lifeless. In panic, the three disposed of her body in the forest, far from the city. They spent 2 more days cleaning the car meticulously before delivering it to Chris. Chris then asked why Jake appeared out of the blue to speak. He replied that he had been encountering her every day, deceiving him constantly. He encountered her haunting him every day. As for Jake's friend who went with him that night, the first person was shot dead by someone in the gambling den. As for the other person, he commits suicide for reasons unknown. Afterward, Chris's friend surrendered to the police and led them to the scene of the incident, where they found the real body of the young woman. After everything was over, Chris thought it was all in the past. But then one night, while he was sleeping at home, the car keys light above the headboard lit up again, along with the sound of the car door opening. Now, the event with the woman was revisiting Chris once more. He slowly looked down and saw the woman walking out of the car door as before, but this time she looked normal. She walked towards the front gate of the house and smiled at him. With fear, Chris quickly turned his face back to the bed and told her, "Why have you come to deceive me again? Everything should be over." He also told her that he would sell the car. No matter what, he would sell the car even if he had to lose some profit. That night, he accidentally fell asleep and dreamt that he was driving somewhere with the woman who had come to deceive him. Suddenly, she spoke up, "Chris, this car registration is beautiful." The next morning, as soon as Chris woke up, he hurriedly took the money he had and went to buy a lottery ticket with the same number as the car's registration. In the end, on the day the lottery was drawn, Chris won the jackpot, nearly 1 million baht. To this day, he still uses that car as usual, not selling it to anyone, because he feels that the car has become destined for him.